The mountain road twisted endlessly upward, each turn devoured by fog that clung to the edges of the student's lantern. The monastery rose from the mist like a wound in the sky, all stone and silence, its windows black with centuries of neglect. He had imagined a place of peace, of whispered prayers and dust-covered wisdom. Yet what greeted him was something hollow, like the echo of a faith long abandoned. The gate creaked open by itself, and somewhere beyond, a bell rang though no hand pulled its rope. The air thickened with incense and old breath. As though the monastery itself exhaled, the ghosts of devotion passed. He stepped inside, unaware that the ground beneath him hummed faintly with voices too ancient to name. The students' quarters were narrow and cold, built of the same gray stone as the corridors below. The walls seemed to breathe with the night wind, sighing through unseen cracks. He unpacked his notebooks, trying to fill the silence with the scratch of a pen. Yet the monastery answered only with stillness. Outside, the fog pressed against the small window, like a living thing. The bell tolled once, then fell silent, leaving behind a faint hum that settled into his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening, something patient, ancient, and waiting for him to close his eyes. He woke with a start, unsure when sleep had taken him. The candle had burned to a pool of wax, and the air had grown colder. A soft sound rose from outside, melodic, rhythmic, neither human nor entirely unnatural. It wasn't birds, or wind, or prayer, but something older. He sat up, heart thudding, listening as voices merged into harmony. Each note seemed to pull at the marrow of his bones. He moved to the window, searching the darkness below. The chanting came from the graveyard, swelling and fading like the tide. Yet, no light, no figures, no movement. Only the sound, steady as breath. He crept from his room, drawn by the sound as if sleepwalking. Each step echoed too loudly, yet the chanting continued, unbroken. The halls were darker than before, the candle sconces empty. The air smelled of wax and damp stone, but beneath it lay something faintly sweet, like decayed flowers. The sound led him to a small door at the corridor's end, a chapel, unlit, its door slightly ajar. Through the gap he saw only the glow of moonlight spilling across the altar and something moving just beyond sight, swaying gently to the rhythm of the chant. The chapel was empty, yet the chant persisted, low and distant, vibrating through the stone floor beneath his feet. Candles unlit lined the altar, their wax long hardened into pale stalactites. The crucifix above the altar leaned slightly, as though weary from centuries of watching. He approached, whispering a greeting no one could hear, and the air thickened. For an instant, the floor seemed to pulse. One heartbeat, then silence. The chant ceased abruptly, leaving a void so complete it roared in his ears. In that quiet, he felt the eyes of something vast and unseen open upon him. The morning brought no warmth. Light poured through the chapel windows like thin smoke, failing to chase the night from the corners. The student tried to convince himself that what he'd heard had been wind through the crypts, but the rhythm still lingered in his skull, a memory too precise for imagination. The monks he passed offered silent nods, their eyes downcast, their movements too synchronized, as if mimicking some unspoken prayer. When he asked about the chanting, Brother Thomas only said, "The mountain remembers." His voice trembled slightly, betraying a fear that age alone could not explain. The library was a labyrinth of candle-lit alcoves, the air heavy with the perfume of decay. The student ran his fingers along the spines of volumes, bound in cracked leather, their titles eroded to whispers. The silence here was not empty. It was full, pulsing with intent. When he reached the section marked Chants of the Departed, he found a manuscript open on a lectern, pages fluttering though there was no wind. The ink shimmered faintly, symbols twisting like worms. One line, translated roughly, read, "To silence them is to wake them." He shut the book, but the pages continued to turn. Outside, clouds had gathered thick and low, smothering the mountain in shadow. The chanting began again at noon. Impossible, distant yet within the walls. Elias followed it through empty corridors, each turn leading him back to where he'd started. The sound was not coming from below, but from behind the walls themselves, as if hundreds of voices were buried there, reciting their devotion through stone. When he pressed his ear to the wall, the words became clearer, syllables shaped like prayer, yet laced with something mournful, pleading. Then came another voice. His own name, whispered softly. Brother Thomas found him still standing there, pale and shivering. He guided Elias toward the courtyard, speaking softly of discipline and devotion. But his words wandered like someone quoting memories instead of thought. Thomas paused by a fountain choked with moss. "There was a time," he said, "when we buried them alive to preserve the chant." His eyes lifted to the mountainside, where the graveyard loomed beneath a gathering storm. "Faith," he whispered, "has a sound." And in that moment, Elias understood that the chant was not a warning. It was a promise. That night, the chanting returned before midnight, louder this time, closer, inside the monastery walls. Elias lit his lantern and opened his door, but the corridor beyond was empty, the air vibrating with low voices that moved past him like wind. He followed them to the stairwell, heart racing until they stopped abruptly, replaced by a single note that lingered and faded into silence. When he turned to retreat, his candlelight fell upon fresh footprints leading to his room, bare, wet, and small. They stopped at his bedside. Sleep no longer obeyed him. When Elias closed his eyes, he saw corridors where walls pulsed like flesh and faces formed from stone. In dreams, the chant became words, Latin phrases that made sense only as sound. He awoke each time gasping, the rhythm of the chant beating against his heart. The monks no longer met his gaze, and Brother Thomas's silence had turned from patience to warning. On the third night, Elias found a locked chamber behind the library shelves. He did not remember how he knew the key would be in Thomas's cell, only that his hand was already reaching for it. The chamber was small, circular, and lined with shelves that reached the ceiling. No windows, only candles that burned without melting. In the center stood a lectern draped in red cloth, and upon it, an open manuscript unlike the others. The ink shimmered wetly, as though freshly written, though dust covered the floor thick as fur. Each line pulsed faintly with breath, the words rearranging as he watched. It was not Latin, not entirely. When he whispered one line aloud, the air around him trembled. From somewhere below, the chorus answered. When dawn came, the chanting did not fade. It grew louder. Elias stumbled into the courtyard, the sound threading through every crack in the monastery's walls. The monks were assembled in rows, their mouths moving though no sound escaped. Only the chant, everywhere and nowhere, he cried out, demanding to know who sang. But their lips froze mid-word. The silence that followed was heavier than the chant itself. From the chapel door came a whisper, a man's voice, calm and ancient. They sing because you listen. He locked himself in his room, trying to silence the chant with his own voice. He tore pages from his notebook, wrote down fragments of the words that haunted him. Each letter burned behind his eyelids when he blinked. His pen scratched in rhythm with the unseen choir. His hand moved even when he tried to stop. The language poured out of him, ancient and relentless. When he looked down, the ink on the page was red, not from the pen. From the window, the graveyard seemed to sway, crosses tilting as if nodding to the rhythm. By the fourth night, he no longer feared the chanting. It was familiar now, almost comforting. A heartbeat beneath the stone. When he descended to the chapel again, the doors opened before him. The altar was draped in shadows, yet the air shimmered like heat. From the darkness stepped a figure wearing the vestments of an abbot, its face hidden by a rotted cowl. The voice that spoke was not a whisper, but many, 1,000 layered tones that filled the hall and his mind alike. "You have written our name," it said. "Now you will sing." The storm broke after midnight, and with it came the voices. Elias stood at his window, staring down at the graveyard where pale lanterns moved among the tombs, slow, deliberate, like mourners, lost in endless prayer. Each light belonged to a monk whose body had long since rotted, their silhouettes wavering through fog. The chanting rolled up the hillside, so clear now that Elias could make out the words. They were not asking for mercy, they were calling someone home. His heart answered before his voice did, and he stepped into the rain. The courtyard was drowned in mist, every sound muffled, except the chant that pulsed like a heart beneath the rain. Elias followed it, barefoot, across slick stones toward the graveyard gate. The air was heavy, as though the mountain itself breathed. Each step brought him closer to the procession. Lanterns floated among the graves, never flickering, never wavering. The monks' heads turned in unison as he approached, revealing faces both human and skeletal, their eyes faintly aglow like embers in dying coals. One reached out a hand. Elias took it. They led him between the graves, where the names had been erased by centuries of weather. The chant surrounded him, woven from hundreds of voices, each vibrating within his ribs. The monks' steps made no sound, yet the earth trembled beneath them. The fog glowed from within, as if the ground itself held light. Elias felt both small and infinite, no longer a visitor but a witness to something that had never died. Ahead, the procession stopped before a crypt sealed in stone. The chanting shifted, the door began to move. When the crypt opened, the chant deepened, no longer sung by voices alone, but by the earth itself. Air rushed out like a sigh too old to belong to any living thing. Inside were rows of stone beds, each occupied by a monk whose flesh had not decayed, their lips still parted mid-prayer. Their eyes were open. Elias stepped across the threshold, feeling the pull of centuries drag against his chest. He realized then that the living monks were not keepers. They were echoes. The true order sang beneath. From the far end of the crypt came a light, pulsing in rhythm with the chant. The monks turned toward it, their forms thinning like smoke as they bowed. Elias approached, unable to resist. Upon a stone altar lay a book bound in bone, its pages fluttering though there was no wind. Words burned across them, each line echoing in his skull. His hand moved of its own accord, fingers tracing the letters as he whispered their sound. The chanting rose in answer, flooding the crypt until the light engulfed everything. When the light faded, Elias found himself alone. The crypt no longer glowed, and the air had thickened into stillness. He could hear only his heartbeat, and beneath it, the faintest hum, steady and low. The walls dripped with moisture that smelled of iron and incense. Every breath stirred the dust of centuries. He turned slowly, realizing that the procession was gone, that the graves above had sealed him in. Yet, the chanting had not ceased. It had only gone inward, echoing from within his ribs, his throat, his skull. The monastery above was silent, but he was not alone in silence. He descended deeper through a narrow stairway carved into the stone behind the altar. Each step echoed like a heartbeat inside a tomb. The air grew warmer, sweeter, carrying the scent of decay laced with incense. The passage opened into a chamber lined with effigies, dozens of monks carved from wax, lifelike and kneeling in eternal prayer. But one, at the far end, moved, its lips parted slightly, whispering syllables too soft to catch. Elias froze. The figure's eyes rolled upward beneath a film of wax, and the chant resumed. Lo, unified, alive. The air trembled as if the mountain itself exhaled. Elias knelt before the moving effigy, watching as cracks split its waxen face, revealing flesh beneath, gray, pulsing faintly. It whispered a single phrase, "Sing, or they will wake." The chant behind the walls grew louder, shaking dust from the ceiling. The effigies shuddered in unison, their wax hands rising as one. Elias pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound bypassed flesh. It vibrated through his bones, urging his voice to join. Against his will, his lips began to move. The ground split beneath the altar as the chant reached its peak. A rush of air howled upward, carrying with it the scent of rot and roses. Elias staggered back, shielding his face as the effigies collapsed into pools of wax. From the darkness below rose shapes, figures clothed in tattered vestments, their faces hidden beneath veils. They carried no light, yet the chamber glowed around them. The abbot's voice filled the air, no longer distant, but near, resonant, tender. "We are the breath between life and death. You have opened the mouth of the mountain." The abbot reached out his hand, palm open, and Elias stepped forward without hesitation. The walls quivered, alive with chanting now too vast to be human. The abbot placed his hand upon Elias's chest. A cold fire spread through him, first pain, then ecstasy, then nothing at all. The chanting stopped, replaced by silence so complete it seemed holy. The abbot whispered, "You have remembered the song." And when Elias opened his mouth, the voice that emerged was not his own. It was ancient, countless, eternal, and the mountain answered. Days passed, or perhaps none did. Elias could no longer tell when it was night or morning, for the chant drowned all measure of time. It lived within him now, threading through his thoughts like veins of gold through stone. When he spoke, echoes followed that did not belong to his own throat. The monastery above had grown quieter. The monks moved like phantoms, heads bowed as if listening to something beneath the floor. In his reflection, Elias saw another face layered upon his, older, robed, serene. He began to understand the prayer, not as words, but as hunger. Brother Thomas entered without sound, his presence smaller than the silence itself. He found Elias kneeling before the window, eyes unfocused, lips trembling with half-formed syllables. "You've heard them," Thomas whispered. Elias turned slowly, his pupils pale and glowing like moonlit glass. "They're inside me," he murmured, his voice layered with others. Thomas fell to his knees, clutching his rosary until the beads split, muttering a prayer that cracked halfway through. "Then it is done," he breathed. "The mountain has chosen." Elias smiled faintly, and the wind outside answered in harmony. The monastery no longer stood still. Its corridors twisted when he walked them, stairs leading down when they once led up. The chanting filled every hollow, not from below, but from within the walls, the stones, the wood. Elias touched one and felt it pulse in rhythm with his heart. Every sound echoed in harmony. His footsteps, his breath, his thoughts. He began to write again, but the words were not his own. When he looked down, the ink on the page was shifting, forming shapes like mouths mid-prayer. He no longer wrote to study. He wrote to continue. Sleep was no longer a boundary. In dreams, he stood beneath the mountain, surrounded by monks who had no faces, only mouths. They sang not in worship, but in continuity, a song that held the world still. Elias joined them willingly, his voice rising and blending until he could no longer hear where he ended. When he awoke, he was standing in the chapel, barefoot. Candles burned to nubs around him. The chant had not stopped when he slept. It had simply moved from dream into breath, carrying his name like a refrain. Brother Thomas tried once more to save him. He brought holy water, relics, and trembling faith. But when he touched Elias's shoulder, the chant erupted through both of them. Thomas fell, gasping, as light poured from Elias's mouth like smoke. "It's not death," Elias whispered. "It's remembrance." The sound filled the hall, weaving through every corridor, every grave, every crack in the mountain. Thomas's eyes rolled back, his lips moving in reluctant unison. Elias stood above him, radiant and terrible, his voice no longer human but endless. The monastery answered in perfect harmony. Dawn crept over the mountains, pale and colorless, yet no bell rang to greet it. The monastery lay still, cloaked in ash and silence. Within the chapel, Elias knelt before the altar, motionless. The chant had become the air itself, no longer heard but felt, humming beneath the ribs of the living and the dead alike. He had forgotten language, name, and purpose, yet his mouth never ceased to move. When the first light touched the crucifix above him, every candle flared back to life, though none had wicks. The air shimmered as if remembering how to breathe. 3 days later, rescuers from the nearby village climbed the mountain, guided by the absence of the monastery's bell. They found doors open, corridors empty, and rooms thick with dust that no longer fell. In the courtyard, they discovered the monks kneeling in neat rows, their faces serene, eyes open but lifeless. Each pair of lips was frozen mid-word, as though still caught in song. From beneath the earth, a low hum trembled. A sound too vast to place. One of the men whispered, "It's singing," and crossed himself twice. Though his hands shook, they found Elias in the graveyard. He was seated between two weathered tombs, hands folded neatly in his lap, his face calm as if deep in prayer. His eyes were open, pale as bone, fixed upon the horizon. His lips moved ceaselessly, shaping words that made no sense to those who listened. The sound was faint, like the rustling of dry leaves, yet carried a rhythm unmistakable, measured, devout, infinite. The rescuers called his name, but he did not answer. One man knelt beside him and felt his pulse, steady, strong, yet utterly raw. The men carried him down the mountain, but the chanting followed. It seeped through the ground, through the wind, through the breath of every living thing. By the time they reached the village, the sound had woven itself into the hum of insects, into the rhythm of footsteps, into the heartbeat of silence. Elias sat unmoving in the cart, eyes fixed forward, mouth still forming that impossible prayer. When the villagers gathered, drawn by the noise, they could not decide whether it was music or mourning. It seemed both. It seemed endless. At night, when all had grown still, the villagers awoke to hear it. The same chant, rising from the valley, from the fields, from beneath their own floors. Those who listened too long began to dream of cloisters and corridors and voices beneath stone. By dawn, the sound had faded, but Elias was gone. Only his robes remained upon the altar of the small village church, folded with care. In the distance, the monastery bell tolled once, though no hand pulled its rope. The mountain exhaled, and somewhere beneath it, a new voice joined the eternal choir.